Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Hi, I'm Juliette Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote, named for Adam Smith, brought to you by Liberty Fund. To learn more, visit www.adamsmithworks.org. Welcome back. Today, on November 16th, 2022, it is my pleasure to welcome back Professor Henry C. Clark. He's a professor at Dartmouth, and he's the director of the Political Economy Project. He is an expert on Montesquieu and so many other people, ideas, thoughts, time periods, all that stuff. It's his second time. Go listen to our podcast about the Enlightenments. Very Adam Smithy. So today we're going to be talking specifically about Montesquieu. He has a really long full name. Professor Clark, if you would like to tell it to us later. But we're going to be talking about his life, his ideas, and his influence. Welcome back to the podcast.
Well, it's great to talk to you again, Juliette. Thank you very much for having me on.
What is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
You're trying to make me enemies, aren't you? So let me just preface, I knew you were going to come up with this question because you always do. Let me preface my answer by simply saying that I love my students. They get me up in the morning every day. They keep me going. I think my students are just wonderful. They are far better than I or my generation was in many, many ways. I'm sure that the future of the world is in good hands, in the hands of my students and their generation. But as the premise of your question suggests, of course, no generation is perfect, and this one is no exception. So this time, I'd like to answer your question by suggesting that one of the things that this generation of young people does not have very much of, it seems to me, is a sense of limits. And again, this is not their fault. They were born and grew up, for the most part, during that holiday of history between 1989 and, let's say, 2015, 2016, when it seemed as if we had reached the end of history, and when it seemed like there might really be no limits to what humans might accomplish. But I think one of the byproducts of that experience is that we have a generation of young people today who have a relatively weak sense, it seems to me, of limits imposed either by nature or by God or the gods. And usually throughout human history, if there is a movement away from the gods, it tends to be a movement in the direction of nature. And conversely, in periods where there is a movement towards God or towards the gods or towards religion, it tends to be a movement away from nature. But there's a very real sense, it seems to me, that this generation of young people has a weak sense of the limits of either God or nature, that they have been taught to believe that culture is a matter of sheer willpower. It can be conjured out of thin air, and it can be made to respond in pretty much any way that we as a group or groups may want it to. And I can't help but think that some of the problems, some of the frustrations and disappointments that this generation of young people seems to experience, according to surveys, might have precisely to do with the weakness and sense of limits and guardrails, guideposts that they have taken as part of their lives. That's my own view. Other people will think otherwise, perhaps. And as I say, I think in general, the world will be a fine place in their hands. But it's certainly something that I've noticed more and more, actually, especially in the last 10 years or so, with the advent of social media.
It sounds like you've given this a lot of thought. It's a remarkable response. Like there's a lot of food for thought there.
There is a lot to unpack, and fortunately, I knew you weren't going to ask me to unpack it here because we're here to talk about Montesquieu. But certainly, there is a lot to unpack. I mean, young people are my métier. As I say, I love them dearly. They make my life meaningful, and so I do think a great deal about what young people are like, what they are doing, what they are able to do, what they are unable to do, where their inclinations lie. And of course, a graybeard like myself has seen quite a number of students through the decades pass through the portals. And so, yes, I have had the occasion, let's say, to do quite a lot of thinking about this subject.
So let's talk about a man who focuses a lot on limitations and seems to have a thorough understanding of them. Many Americans have heard of Montesquieu, at least from elementary school civics class. I'd imagine that they'd say, "Oh, him, separation of powers or something government." I would have said that a few years ago because I had no idea. Can you give us a quick elevator pitch for Montesquieu and his ideas before we jump in?
In a way, that's basically it. I mean, for an American, the quick elevator pitch is that if you value the separation of powers, if you value checks and balances in your government, and those are things, they are among the few things, I think, that are valued across the political spectrum in a bipartisan and multi-partisan sort of way, then you have partly, maybe largely, Montesquieu to thank for that. He was the one who really devised and developed the ideas of limited government and of separation of powers, checks and balances. And from his working out of that whole problem, the American founders relied extensively on his formulations in the debates that they had over how to design the U.S. Constitution. And similar debates took place in other countries as well, in England and France during the Revolution of 1789. Montesquieu was a lively presence as well. But I don't know that there is really any place where Montesquieu has been more sort of present at the creation, so to speak, than in the case of the Americans. So that's what I would say. I would say that the elevator pitch is separation of powers and checks and balances. And of course, it's one of those things. You hear it so often, it does become a cliche, and it seems maybe like a crusty, hoary, old-fashioned 18th century cliche, until somebody from the opposite party does something that you intensely don't like. And then all of a sudden, people rediscover the importance, the enduring importance, as well as the enduring fragility, I might say, of the separation of powers and checks and balances. It's not and I would put it this way. I would say that these things are not settled achievements, settled accomplishments that we can just kind of squeeze into our back pocket and forget about them. Every generation has to grapple with their meaning. Every generation has to struggle with a new set of specific issues and specific challenges to the ideals of limited government. And every generation has to rediscover the wisdom of Montesquieu about them. So there's my elevator pitch.
So can you tell us about the time period that he lived in? What was happening in France? What was happening in his life?
Absolutely. Well, he was born in 1689. It was the depths of the reign of Louis XIV. It was a reign that was dedicated to warfare and conquest, and especially the second half of the reign, which I would say ran from about 1685 with the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, granting religious toleration to the Protestants, until Louis's death in 1715. So that's a 30-year period. That period was given over almost entirely to warfare. And the warfare was largely initiated by France. And the rest of Europe suspected the French government of aspiring to a kind of universal monarchy. And so strategically, it was a fairly unique period in a pre-modern history. It would be replayed in a certain way, I suppose, under Napoleon. But domestically also, it was a time of great upheaval. There were horrific disruptions in daily life, including the bare essentials of life, growing and harvesting and distributing food for the people. There were two massive episodes of real hunger and, in fact, even famine in France, partly generated by the war and partly generated indirectly by the disruptions caused by the various wars. One of them was in 1693 and 94, brought on partly by particularly cold weather. The other one in 1709. And by the end of it all, by the end of Louis's life, and that was in 1715, and at that time, he had been officially the King of France in 1643. So let me do my fifth grade math here. That's about 72 years. That's 3/4 of a century. That's a fairly long time for people to have the same ruler in place. France was in many ways exhausted physically, militarily, exhausted economically, exhausted fiscally. Very few, if any, of the real overriding strategic goals of all that warfare had been achieved. And so there was a real sense when he died of, on the one hand, relief. Ordinary people were singing rather unflattering ditties about the deceased king, but also in more elevated circles and more refined elite circles. The period right after 1715 was marked by a sense of opening, a sense that, okay, 72 years is long enough. Let's see if we can rethink France. Let's see if we can rethink the monarchy, and let's see if we can rethink our relations with the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. And so that did give a place to a sense of intellectual experimentation and poetic imagination. There was a kind of underground libertine community of poets that emerged after 1715. And it was in that context that Montesquieu really sort of came of age as an intellectual figure. He had already been to school. He had gotten a regular sort of what we would call a humanistic or a liberal arts education from the Oratorians. He had also gotten a legal education. He had inherited from his uncle an actual legal office because Montesquieu was born into an aristocratic family. And when his uncle died in 1716, Montesquieu actually inherited that office. We don't think of offices as being inherited today, but it was a kind of they were sort of mixtures of public and private entities at that time. And so he actually became a magistrate in the Parlement, which was in a judicial and an administrative entity in France. And that was in 1716. But at the same time, he became keenly interested in the broader intellectual currents of the period, including he became a member of the local academy in Bordeaux, where he conducted experiments, he observed experiments, he wrote up reports, he served as an officer on the academy. But the main thing that he did for our interests, Juliet, is he sat down to write a work that sort of took everything that had been happening in recent years in France, in the rest of Europe, and indeed in the world. And he just poured it into this extraordinarily complex, intricate network of supposed letters that he called the lettres persanes, the Persian letters. And that became not only a classic of world literature, it became a kind of an opening salvo in the 18th century Enlightenment. It showed the way that later 18th century thinkers could criticize and explore, could criticize existing laws, institutions, and practices, customs, beliefs, and explore new ways of doing things without getting themselves in trouble with the censorship authorities. And it was such a phenomenally successful work. It was a travel account. The premise, I suspect you've probably read the Lettres Persanes, but for those of your listeners who have not, the premise was that there were a couple of elite members of the Persian ruling elite who had decided for various reasons to sojourn, to travel outside their own country and explore the world. And so these two figures traveled the world, and they ended up in Paris, of all places. And so through their voices and the voices of all the characters that they had left home, including the men's wives in the harem, the seraglio, back in Persia, Montesquieu was able, behind that rather thin disguise, to launch a genuinely free-minded, free-spirited, extraordinarily subtle, insightful, and challenging critique of just about every aspect of life in his time. And it was such a phenomenal success, partly because it was indeed entertaining, partly because it was indeed a bit edgy. It attracted the unfavorable attention of some of the religious authorities, but also because it really did put into public discussion things that had not really been fully aired in the public, especially in France or other Catholic countries where the censorship apparatus was particularly strong. And so it created a new baseline, as it were, for thinking about just about every aspect of life in Europe and the world at that time. Political constitutions, social structures, the role of commerce and industry and agriculture, population, the place of women in society, a particularly important theme in the Persian letters, since the figures in the Seraglio ended up being really important characters in the unfolding of the story of the Persian letters. So it became a kind of a vade-mecum, as it were. And Montesquieu reported that a bookseller had told me, everywhere I go, people tell me, so when are we going to get more of these Persian letters? I mean, when's the next installment coming out? They wanted a series. They wanted a regular sort of annual series of these things. And if it were around today, I'm sure that Netflix would probably have little difficulty in figuring out how to turn it into a series. But Montesquieu was content with just the one go-round, and it made his reputation. It enabled him to be inducted into the French Academy, just on the strength of that one rather edgy work. And it just made him a kind of an essential reference point for any discussion that might be going on, economic, social, political, religious, you name it. It was all there in the space of not too many pages, 300 pages or so in a modern paperback. So that's the main thing that I would say about his life and times, is that he came to prominence as one person among many who responded to the manifest failures of the Louis XIV model of modernization. Top-down, centralized monarchy, rational bureaucratic administration, all put to the service of the glory of the state. That was sort of the Louis XIV model. And by Montesquieu's time, there was general agreement that model had failed in important ways, but the entire 18th century was required to sort of work out what a workable alternative model might be.
Who were his contemporaries at the time, and what sort of ideas were they putting out, and how did he you've painted a good picture of how he came into prominence and how he kind of shifted the dialogue a bit, but how different were his ideas? What did he contribute overall
that others did not?
Yes. And who are these others?
Okay. Yeah, right. Well, because he addressed so many different topics, the answer to your question has to be a fairly long one. From a religious point of view, he was as I mentioned, he was educated in the Oratorian school, and so Montbranche was a great influence. But he had read the 17th century moralists, La Rochefoucauld and Pascal. He had certainly read Montaigne. He knew about the essay form, and all of those authors I just mentioned fit perfectly into the milieu that he lived in, which emphasized short, not terribly learned works, but very subtle, very witty, very clever, very elusive, the art of concision. All of them were masters of that. So from that point of view, those were his contemporaries. He came just after Hobbes and Spinoza. He was a contemporary of Pierre Bayle, and he engaged all three of those authors in his notebooks and in his some cases in his works. He recoiled from some of the hints of atheism or materialism that you found in Hobbes and Spinoza. He rejected Pierre Bayle's idea that you could create an entire society of moral people who were atheists. So he was one of those few leading figures of the modern world, architects, intellectual architects, we might say, of the modern world, who maintained his religious faith. Did not become a sharp, a severe critic of religious faith per se. He certainly had plenty of criticism of the papacy and of the Catholic Church, but there were other contemporaries of his whose views of religion were quite different. I've already mentioned Hobbes, Spinoza, and Bayle. David Hume was a little bit younger. He was about a generation or so younger than Montesquieu, but he became a friend of Montesquieu's, and he became perhaps the most famous atheist of the 18th century. Montesquieu did not go in that direction. If we're thinking about political thought, well, certainly he was aware of the Republican tradition in England. Algernon Sidney and people like that. He also was aware, of course, of John Locke. It's a very confusing question how much of that whole English liberal / Republican tradition Montesquieu intended to incorporate into his own worldview. I think maybe one way to answer your question about what exactly did he add, which is an excellent way of putting it, really, because he was a respectful and careful reader of all of these contemporaries that I've mentioned, would be to say that he is that none of them are really looked upon as the founders of disciplines such as comparative sociology or even, to a certain extent, anthropology or comparative study of comparative cultures. He was a highly original and talented relativist, which is not to say that he was a moral relativist. That's one of the questions that we have whenever we read Montesquieu is, where are the norms? Where are the moral standards here? Where are the absolutes? We know that he was open to there being absolutes, but they are elusive in his account because he is so open and so respectful and so creative in the way that he brings in the cultural practices of this Central Asian tribe or this Native American tribe or this ancient people that the Greeks wrote about or the Romans wrote about or whoever it may happen to be. His method of juxtaposing all of these different experiences that different peoples have had throughout the past and present, and making them yield ideas, usable ideas about how to think about this, that, or the other topic, how to think about liberty, how to think about commerce, how to think about population or reproductive practices, how to think about the role of climate, the role of terrain, topography, I guess we would say, or geology, all of these different things. He certainly broke new ground in all of them. And I would go further and say this, maybe the most important thing that he did, and it's strange to say that it's a new thing, but he made public, political, constitutional debate into a public matter. And he showed the way to making those topics usable in a public forum. Now, that doesn't sound like much from your point of view or my point of view. We take it for granted. Well, of course, people are going to talk publicly about public matters like that. But there was very little actual public policy debate in France in the first half of the 18th century because of the censorship apparatus, which was not nearly as severe as it was, let's say, in Spain under the Inquisition. But nonetheless, there was not really a lively debate about public policy, even in a field like political economy in France, as there was either in Holland or across the Channel in England. Studies have been done, for example, of the publication of works on topics in political economy. And what they've shown is that the 1750s was an enormous breakthrough decade, particularly in France. And it was almost entirely because Montesquieu had shown the way to cover the full range of things that were on people's minds in his 1748 book, the last book that he worked on, the one that took him 20 years by his account, The Spirit of the Laws. And that book, which was made up of 30 different books, they were called books, it covered things like political economy and constitutional law, population, demography, what we would call demography, all kinds of things that tract writers and others had been writing about in England and in Holland for a long time. But it showed how a learned, a leading intellectual could make those topics into a usable forum for public discussion, and they became topics of public discussion in France in the 1750s and 60s in a way that they had never been before. And my guess is, and who knows, we can never write history anew with counterfactuals, but my own guess is that had it had not been for the publication of his book L'Esprit des Lois in 1748, you would have most likely had a considerably less lively public debate emerging in France, and by extension in the rest of Europe too, since at that point the rest of Europe derived a lot of its intellectual inspiration from France at all. So that's now. If this sounds like a diffuse sort of answer to your question, I think that his influence, Montesquieu's influence, really was diffuse. I mentioned that there is a lot of political economy in The Spirit of the Laws. We don't think of it as a work about political economy, and yet some specialists have determined that as much as a sixth of the entire 800-page book is devoted to topics that you and I would recognize as political economy topics. I'll give you one other small example. He had a few things to say about whether the nobility should be allowed to engage in trade. Well, that was a contested question in France, where the nobility were not. There had been statutes, royal decrees against that for various reasons for 150 years or more. Just a few things that Montesquieu had to say about the subject completely revitalized that whole issue. And in the space of about 18 or 24 months in the late 1750s, there were dozens new pamphlets, new ideas sprouting forth on that very question. Almost all of it directly inspired by what Montesquieu had to say about them. So he became a kind of, it's a figure that we don't really have very much of today. He became a kind of generic authority figure. I mean, he spoke with authority about a whole wide range of topics. It goes without saying he did not have a university position. Few, if any, of the major Enlightenment figures of the 18th century did have university positions, especially in France. But Montesquieu, his background was even further removed from a university life than most. He was an aristocrat. He lived on his estate. For a few years, he did, in fact, practice the profession of a magistrate, but didn't like it very much. So he ended up being a man of letters and a man of the world. And yet he became this sort of this man of immense authority across a whole wide range of different topics, which is not in any way, shape, or form, of course, to say that people agreed with everything he said. Almost no one agreed with everything that Montesquieu had said, and there were a lot of things that people disagreed with. But he added diffusely, but he added enormously to the intellectual culture and the public debate, including the public policy debate of the mid-18th century.
So that was the influence he had majorly in Europe and in France. What sort of an influence did he have in America? Like, we know that our system comes from all these Enlightenment thinkers that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and all these guys were reading at the time. Can you kind of lay out for us what comes from Montesquieu in our current system?
Well, actually, more than we might think. Generally speaking, both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists cited Montesquieu as the authority on the kinds of constitutional questions that they were grappling with. So they all agreed, both the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, but both sides agreed that they wanted to establish a government that would not have any of the vices or evils of the British monarchy that they had just rebelled against. So they did not want a monarchy, and some of them thought that monarchy itself was a very, very large part of the problem that they had had with the British government. Now, that makes things a little awkward because it's by no means clear that Montesquieu was an apostle of non-monarchical government. On the contrary, he bent over backwards to suggest in multiple places in his writings that a monarchy had many virtues, that the French monarchy in particular had many virtues, and it was likely to be a sustainable form of government, that the leading categories of analysis for him were not monarchy versus republic, but moderate government versus immoderate government. And moderate government was a government by the rule of law, and a monarchy was perfectly capable in principle and quite successful in many cases. In practice, Montesquieu believed, and others too for that matter, of actually maintaining a rule of law type of polity under monarchy. The Americans, of course, were different. And so they immediately read Montesquieu in a slightly different way from the way that English or European readers did. They took him to be someone who could inspire a resolutely non-monarchical regime And the pillars were, as we've discussed, both the separation of powers and the checks and balances. So both of which fit comfortably within the broad canopy of this overarching idea of moderate government, since they are designed, as Madison put it, ambition must be checked by ambition. And the purpose of that mutual check was precisely to moderate the overweening hubristic ambitions that all political leaders, with their visionary schemes and their utopian ideals and their narrow-minded plans, like the man of system and Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, to impose upon the people, treating the people as pieces on a chessboard, as Smith put it. That was that was what limited government was about, and Montesquieu was primarily the primary inspiration in achieving it. I've seen one very authoritative study that claims that Montesquieu was read and cited more often than any other author by the founding generation of Americans from, let's say, 1760 to about 1800 or so. And one study concludes that the second place finisher, John Locke, was read and cited only about a quarter as much as Montesquieu was. So Montesquieu was the authority for the kinds of problems that the American founders wanted to solve. Let me also interject here. I know that you've read your Rousseau. Rousseau had, of course, written a number of different works, notably The Social Contract in 1762. Rousseau didn't have anywhere near the kind of authority, the kind of respect, or the kind of influence with the American founders that Montesquieu did. The only other thing that I would add to my answer to your question is that you can find, just like I was saying a moment ago, that you can find Montesquieu's fingerprints all over even small and obscure questions in the European debate over things like the commercial nobility, whether the question of whether the nobility should be allowed by law to engage in trade. The same is true in the American founding as well. If you look at the state level debates over criminal justice reform, Montesquieu is all over that debate. And maybe it's worthwhile reflecting for a moment on why that is. So one of Montesquieu's signal moves as a thinker was to address the whole question of what is liberty. And it was a question that just about every tract writer, every hack, every second-rate author of the first half of the 18th century was weighing in on. And Montesquieu answered the question by referring to sort of the subjective sentiment or the subjective feeling that every individual person has of being safe and secure. There's no liberty where you lack that sense that your person, your body, your individuality is secure from encroachment by someone else. Now, that was a very interesting definition. There's a lot that could be said about it, but the one thing that I would say about it right in this context is that it's especially salient for thinking about criminal justice reform. If you have a government whose law enforcement activities make you feel insecure, whose conduct cannot be predicted, and whom you cannot trust to follow rules of procedure and rules of fairness, that is a fundamental assault upon individual liberty, according to Montesquieu. And so that's one reason why the criminal justice debates in America also featured Montesquieu all over the place. And there are many other examples as well, but I'm afraid I've probably gone on long enough on this question.
I love to hear it. You brought up so many things that were reminding me of this quote that I mentioned to you before we started recording, which is this quote that I found from the French edition in the preface of John Maynard Keynes's General Theory, which is an interesting place to find a Montesquieu reference, at least I think. And he says, quote, "Montesquieu was the real French equivalent of Adam Smith," end quote. Do you agree with this? What are the similarities and differences between the two of them? If Montesquieu isn't, then who is the real French equivalent of Adam Smith? Is there an equivalent of Adam Smith? So many questions.
So many questions, and it's a great question. It would, of course, have made at least as much, if not more sense, to ask whether Adam Smith was the Scottish version of Montesquieu, since Smith was, of course, 34 years younger than Montesquieu, and Montesquieu had died before Smith published his first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments.
I thought I had my dates confused when I read that. I was like, wait, do I have my eras mixed up?
Well, I'm also a little puzzled by what Keynes might have meant there. The one thing I would say is, first of all, Smith was in fact called by some reviewers, some French reviewers. His book, The Wealth of Nations, was called a kind of an English version of Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, because Smith's Wealth of Nations was looked upon as a way to design a modern society. It was not looked upon simply as, a technical work in economics, which of course did not exist in the 18th century. It was looked upon as a book that was attempting to do much the same thing that Montesquieu did in the Spirit of the Laws. And what is that same thing? Well, it's to use history. It's to use a comparative study of the law. It's to use a comparative study of customs in order to make sense of the human past, as well as, in Smith's case, the human present, and especially how do you go from being a poor country to being a rich country. So in all of those different ways, I think that Smith and Montesquieu share a very, very strong affiliation, as contrasted, for example, with the physiocrats, whose approach to economics was less historical. It was less comparative, culturally comparative, legally comparative than either Smith or Montesquieu. And of course, the figure in between Smith and Montesquieu was David Hume as well, and I'm sure Keynes was well aware of that. And they all shared much the same method, I would say, which is to study the past, use the past as the laboratory for understanding human nature, and make your generalizations and your inferences on that basis. So the one difference, however, that I would draw is that Montesquieu was very reluctant to be pinned down to a bottom line talking point or takeaway from his work. He was at pains in the preface and elsewhere to claim that he was not trying to tell anybody what to do. He was not trying to get any government to change its ways in any particular way. He was not about revolution. He was not about rebellion or revolt or anything like that. Any government could read his book and find something of value in it. Smith, on the other hand, as you may remember, called his book in one of his letters my very violent attack upon the whole British commercial system. So, I mean, he was quite open about the fact that there were things that he would very much like to see changed, and he named them in very specific parts of the book: the apprenticeship system, the guild system, the law of settlement, and the poor law, and many, many others as well. So his book was more programmatic in that way. It was more directly concerned with current events. He waited for a while. I think we've discussed this before publishing The Wealth of Nations. He wanted to see how the American troubles would turn out. Montesquieu, you get the sense that he really did spend 20 years in that lovely chateau of his down in the southwest of France, close by Bordeaux in La Brede, looking through his fabulous collection of library books and just kind of trying to really figure things out and really develop a new and more scientific way of thinking about the relationship between law on the one hand and every other aspect of human life on the other hand. So I would have to read. I'm not familiar with that passage from Keynes. I would have to read it in order to kind of ponder what he might have had in mind. I see at least as many key differences between Smith and Montesquieu as I do the similarities, but they are. But Smith was very willing to acknowledge his debt to the president of the Chateau of La Brede.
Wow, there's so much. There's so much depth. I don't know. We could keep talking for forever, but I have one final question for you. What is one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
Oh, yes. Okay. Well, again, so many options and so little time here. I think I'm just going to put in another pitch for the problem of secularization theory. So when I was your age, when I was a college student back in the Stone Age, the prevailing belief was that as societies become more scientific, more technological, more economically modern, more enlightened, we might say, religion would become less and less important. And around about the 1990s, some of the most astute students of religion began to acknowledge that theory was wrong. Peter Berger was the most prominent of them in the late 1990s. He basically admitted that he had subscribed to secularization theory, and now he doesn't. And I think this is, and I've gone through a similar belief change myself as I look at the evidence worldwide. Now, I don't think it's possible to understand the world that we live in today unless we take religion seriously, whether it be the current war in Ukraine, whether it be the relationships between Iran and Saudi Arabia, or for that matter, between Iran and Israel. Wherever we look in the world, it seems to me that understanding religion is much, much more important part of understanding what's going on than I would ever have predicted back in the day.
Once again, I'd like to thank my guest for their time and insight, and I'd like to thank you for listening to the Great Antidote podcast. The Great Antidote is sound engineered by Rich Goyette. If you have any questions, any guests or topic recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@gmail.com. Thank you.